People say the heart hardens with time. For Ethan Ridge, it felt stone solid after 10 empty years on a ranch buried deep in the Texas hills. He'd learned the hard way that love can cut and trust can break, so he swore never to unlock that door again. But one October night, the sky split open like a drum and the storm dragged fate to his porch. Thunder cracked across the valley like rifle fire when Ethan heard something that didn't fit the storm's rage, a thin, broken cry riding the wind. He stepped out, boots grinding on the old boards, and froze. A young woman lay crumpled on his doorstep in a ruined wedding dress. Rain glued silk to her skin. Her lace veil hung in ribbons, trailing like torn dreams behind her. For one awful breath, Ethan thought she was already gone. He could have shut the door, poured another black coffee, and pretended the night hadn't brought him anything at all. That's what the Ethan Ridge of the last decade might have done, close himself off and call it survival. But an old habit from the days when he wore a badge tugged at him. He knelt in the rain, jeans soaking through, and checked her pulse. Faint, but there. Easy now, he rasped, his voice rough from years of silence. When he lifted her, he saw dark, finger-shaped bruises circling her wrists, marks he'd seen too many times to mistake. Someone had hurt her. He muttered a low curse, gathered her up like a sack of grain, light even with the dress heavy and sodden, and carried her inside. The fire snapped to life in the stone hearth as he worked. He eased her onto the old couch where he'd sat through long nights convincing himself solitude was safer than hope, then fed the flames and dragged out dry blankets. He kept stealing quick looks at her face. Even pale and spent, she was beautiful, the kind of soft, steady beauty that once made him believe in forever. That thought rattled him more than any outlaw ever had. Hours later, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and green eyes opened, wide and lost. For a second, their gazes locked, and in hers he saw fear, bone-deep weariness, and a stubborn spark that looked like hope trying to live. He felt the walls he'd built around his chest creak. This woman hadn't just fallen onto his porch. She'd slipped into the one place he kept sealed. "You're safe," he said, keeping his distance. "For now." Where am I?" she croaked, voice raw from cold and crying. "My place," Ethan answered. "Middle of nowhere, which looks like where you were headed." Her eyes flicked around the room, measuring exits, checking corners. He knew that look. She wasn't only scared. She was hunted. "You were near frozen," he added. "Dress was soaked through. I set out dry things." He nodded at a folded stack. Plain shirts and pants he kept boxed away. "They belonged to my late wife," he said, voice flattening on the last word. "Thank you," she whispered, like the word hurt. Then, wary, "What do you want?" "Nothing," he said, and surprised himself by meaning it. The storm still hammered the roof, but beneath it Ethan heard something else. Distant hooves beating the mud, slow and certain, drawing closer. The woman's hand flew to her bruised wrist. "They found me," she breathed. "Who?" he asked, already reaching for the rifle that lived by the door. "Cole Voss," she said, and the name hit the room like a drop in temperature. Every lawman from Texas to Nevada knew it. Cole Voss had money, men, and a mean streak. He didn't hear no. "He was supposed to be my husband," she forced out, voice shaking. "Not by my choice." Ethan's jaw tightened. 10 years alone had taught him to step aside from trouble, to let storms blow past. But as he watched her clutch the blanket like armor, something inside him shifted. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen," he said, loading the rifle with hands that hadn't forgotten the motion. "Go there. Stay quiet. I'll send them away." "I won't let you face them alone," she said. "You will," Ethan answered, steady and calm. "I've dealt with worse than Cole Voss." She hesitated, then nodded and slipped toward the back. A polite knock came, soft, almost friendly, and a voice followed with poison under the sugar. "Ridge," it called. "I know she's in there. Hand her over, and we call it square." Ethan stepped onto the porch. Rain soaked his shirt in seconds. For riders waited in the yard like shadows thrown by lightning. The one in front wore fine wool that shed water and a hat low over cold eyes. Not Cole himself, too careful for the first visit, but his second, Silas Hawk, a smile sitting wrong on his face. "She's not here," Ethan said flatly. Silas's grin thinned. "You're making a mistake, old man. That woman belongs to Mr. Voss." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Ethan said. "And if you set one boot on my porch, you'll regret it." The storm seemed to hold its breath. For armed riders against one quiet hermit with a rifle. Ethan didn't blink. He'd outlived loss, lies, and the worst sort of nights. He wasn't adding this woman to a list of failures. Silas studied him, then tugged his reins. "This ain't finished," he said, turning his horse. "You just made yourself an enemy." The riders melted into the dark, water streaming off their coats. Ethan stood there in the rain long after they vanished. He knew Voss would return, and with more men. He also knew something else as he glanced back through the doorway at the woman huddled near the fire. He was done hiding from the world. This time, he'd stand his ground. The next days dragged thin and quiet. The wind worried the eaves. The creek ran high and brown. The woman moved soft around the cabin, staying close to the hearth. She wore clothes that once belonged to someone else and kept her hands busy with simple tasks, stirring stew, mending a torn shirt, stacking kindling, even as her eyes stayed watchful. Ethan tried not to stare, tried not to ask about the scars on her wrists or the tired lines beneath her eyes. He did ask one thing. "What do I call you?" After a pause, she said, "Ava. Ava Lane." He nodded like that settled it. He found reasons to step outside, to walk the fence line and listen. At night he sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, counting the beats of his own heart and the sudden quiet that falls when riders move through wet brush. On the fourth morning, mist clung to the valley like gauze. Then the sound he'd been waiting for rose out of the gray. Hooves, many more this time, closing in with purpose. "They're back," Ethan said quietly. Ava joined him at the small window, face pale but set. "Maybe I should go," she whispered. "If I give myself up, maybe he'll leave you be." "He won't," Ethan said. "Men like Cole don't leave loose ends. And I'm done running." The yard filled with horses and hard faces. A dozen, not four. This time Cole Voss came himself. He slid off his horse with the smooth ease of a man used to owning the ground he stood on. "Trade," he called out, voice clear as the rain let up. "The girl for her brother. You hand her over. Tyler Lane walks free. You get to rot out here in peace." Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle easy in his hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then we turn your place into kindling," Cole said. Before Ethan could answer, Ava moved past him. She stood beneath the porch beam, chin lifted, fear thrumming in her throat but held in check. "I'll go," she said, voice steady enough to carry. "On one condition. Tyler walks free, unharmed. And you leave Mr. Ridge alone." Cole's eyes narrowed. "You forget your place. You've got no room to bargain." "Maybe not," she said, "but if you touch either of them, I'll tell the world what you are." The men around Cole shifted like they'd heard that line before and didn't care. The standstill stretched, tight as wire in the wet air. Then, from the hill, beyond the creek, came a fresh thunder of hooves, different cadence, tighter formation, the sound of riders who trained for it. Badges flashed dull in the gray. 6 federal officers swept down, rifles ready. Their leader, a lean man with a hard, even voice, raised a hand. "Cole Voss," he called, "you're under arrest for murder, extortion, and trafficking." Cole barked a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got no proof." "We've got more than enough," the officer replied, "starting with statements you can't buy." Cole's hand twitched toward his gun. Ethan didn't wait. His shot snapped the air, knocking the pistol from Cole's grip. In the breath after, the yard erupted. It lasted seconds, not minutes. When the smoke cleared and the echoes died, Silas Hawk lay face down in the mud. Cole held tight and cussing, and the rest disarmed or running. The leader holstered his weapon and nodded once to Ethan. "Marshal Avery Holt," he said. "We've been tracking him a long time." Ethan gave a curt nod back, chest burning with a mix of relief and nerves he hadn't felt in years. The storm, finally, was passing. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed in quiet, ordinary ways that felt like breath returning after a long hold. Tyler Lane walked free, shaken but alive. Marshal Holt's team pulled at threads that had been knotted for years, and the web around Cole Voss came apart in daylight. The men who once spoke for him learned to answer to the law again. Papers were filed. Names were named. For the first time in a long while, the county felt like it might belong to regular folks instead of fear. Through it all, Ava stayed. At first there was no choice. The roads were bad. The marshals needed her statement, and her body needed warm food and sleep. But later, when she could have left, she didn't. She slept in the small room at the back and kept to simple rhythms, sweeping the floorboards, washing tin plates, hanging shirts to dry by the hearth. She spoke little. Ethan matched her silence. They learned each other in the bare bones of daily life, who stacked wood straight, who salted stew by habit, who woke at the smallest sound. Some nights, neither of them slept. They'd meet without speaking in the kitchen, where the kettle was always waiting, and drink in the hush. Two people who had lost whole years to pain. Ethan caught himself watching the way Ava's hands, still faintly ringed with bruises, moved with care over the tiniest chores, like doing them right might hold the rest of the world still. He tried not to notice how the light from the fire warmed her face when she smiled at nothing, a small private smile he hadn't seen that first night. He tried, and failed not to hope. The ranch had its own slow work. Fences needed patching after the storm. The roof wanted a line of nails. The creek chewed new edges into the bank that would have to be shored up before spring. Ethan did the heavy lifting and found that sharing a chore list made the day shorter. Ava insisted on helping where she could. Stubbornness, it turned out, was something they had in common. She learned where the boards creaked and which door stuck when it rained. She found the right shelf for the spice tin. She handled his old, scarred coffee pot like it was something worth keeping. On a late afternoon thick with cedar smell, Ethan set down a hammer and realized the quiet wasn't the same as before. It wasn't empty, it was full. He stood on the porch and listened to the low sounds of someone making a home, and felt the weight inside his chest loosen by a notch he hadn't known was there. The nightmares didn't stop at once. Some nights Ava woke with a gasp, palms pressed to her neck, as if invisible hands had grabbed her there. Ethan would speak from the chair by the window, never moving closer than she chose to allow. "You're here. You're safe." Other nights it was Ethan who woke drenched in old memories, the badge that used to sit heavy on his chest, the broken trust that made him leave it on a desk and walk away, the empty years. That followed. On those nights, he'd find Ava already awake, a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the bank coals. She never asked for stories. She just poured coffee and gave space, which somehow felt like understanding. When the court dates came, Marshal Holt rode back through with a stack of papers and a tired grin. "You did right," he told Ava, and she nodded like the words landed somewhere far inside. Ethan offered the marshal a place at the table and a quiet bed for the night. Men who'd once been too scared to speak now sent letters and showed up to testify. The wall of money Cole Voss had built started to crack when small voices pushed together. It didn't make the past vanish. It made the future possible. Winter settled in with clear mornings, blue as old enamel pans, and nights that demanded 2 logs instead of 1. The work changed, more mending indoors, more careful watching of a herd. Ethan and Ava moved around each other without bumping, the way people do when they've learned each other's rhythms. When the wind howled hard enough to rattle the window latches, they read from the thin stack of books Ethan had kept out of habit. Nothing fancy, just dog-eared pages about trails and towns and true north. Sometimes Ava would stop on a line and read it again, slower, like she wanted the words to stick. In those moments, Ethan realized he'd started to imagine a spring with her there to see it. He told himself not to jump. He told himself to be grateful for simple peace. But the heart is a stubborn thing. One evening, as frost stitched white across the ground and the stars snapped bright, Ava stood by the doorway, her coat already on, hair pulled back neat. "I can go now," she said softly. "The roads are clear. The worst is over. You've done more than anyone had a right to ask." Ethan set down the lantern. He looked at her and heard the old rules of self-protection try to speak. Walk her to the road. Wish her well. Close the door. Live small again. The words wouldn't come out. You don't owe me anything, he said instead, steady. But you don't have to leave either. The air held still between them. Ava's mouth trembled, just once. I know, she said. I'm not leaving. Spring crept in true to its nature, slow and sudden at once. Bluebonnets pushed up in shy patches along the fence, and meadowlarks began trying out their voices again. On a clean morning that smelled like wet dirt and fresh sun, church bells in town rang out in a clear, glad tumble. 6 months had passed since the night the storm brought a stranger to Ethan's door. This time, Ava Lane walked down a short aisle by choice, not fear, and placed her hand in Ethan's like she had weighed every mile that led there and found it worth the walk. It wasn't grand. It was honest. A few neighbors came. Marshal Holt stood at the back with a quiet smile. Tyler leaned forward in the front pew like he was memorizing the moment for later. Ethan felt the iron bands he'd lived with for 10 years loosen and fall away. He didn't think about the past when the simple words were spoken. He thought about firelight on winter nights and the sound of a kettle at dawn. He thought about a porch that didn't feel empty. He thought about a heart he'd once mistaken for stone learning to beat easy again. Out at the ranch that evening, the wind slipped warm over the hills, and the sky held the kind of glow that makes even old boards look new. They ate plain food and laughed a little, and didn't push for more than the day could give. Later, when the lamp was turned low and the quiet settled soft, Ethan sat on the step and let the long, hard years run through him and away like water, finally finding its path. Getting older had taught him plenty about how the world can bruise you. It had also taught him that shutting every door doesn't stop the hurt, it just stops the light. He had spent a decade believing that solitude was safer than risk. Then a ruined veil and a whisper of help on a stormy night had asked him to choose again. He chose to open the door. That choice didn't erase the past. It did something simpler and better. It gave both of them a future. If there was a lesson in it, and people tend to look for lessons in stories like this, it wasn't complicated. Kindness is a risk. So is trust. So is love. But sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing alone. Sometimes it's making room for someone else at your table and saying, stay. Ethan Ridge didn't set out to save anyone. He just refused to turn away. In doing that, he found the man he used to be, the one who stood up when it was hard, who believed that right matters even when no one is looking. Ava Lane didn't set out to fix anyone. She told the truth, took back her life, and chose where to set her feet next. Together, they built something steady out of 2 lives that had been shaken. Nothing fancy, nothing grand. Just a home with a good fire, a roof that held, and a promise kept. And on quiet nights, when the wind slips over the hills and the creek talks to the rocks, if you listen close at Ethan Ridge's place, you can hear it, the easy sound of 2 people who made room for hope again, and didn't let the storm have the last word.